Hello and welcome back to the Happya Life Podcast. I'm Clare Deacon. Over the last few episodes, we've been talking about permission, about the cost of holding it all together, about what happens when the roles you've lived inside for years start to loosen, and about why so much of what's being sold as well-being doesn't actually help at that point. Today, I want to talk about what often comes next. Because once the roles have softened, once the old ways of coping no longer quite fit, and once you've stepped back from the noise of being told how you should be well, a very particular feeling can appear, a sense of being unanchored. Now, you know something needs to change. You know you don't want to go back to how things were, but you also don't know where to start, and that can feel deeply unsettling. People often describe this as a feeling of being lost or empty or unsure of themselves, but those words don't quite capture the full story. It's more like internal reference points that you used to rely on just aren't there anymore. You're not falling apart, you're not in a crisis situation, but you're also not clear. And for people who are used to competence, momentum, and knowing what to do next, it can feel quite frightening. This episode is about rebuilding a sense of self when you don't know where to start. Uncertainty doesn't mean you're failing at this stage, it means you're in it. One of the biggest misunderstandings about rebuilding yourself is the idea that it starts with clarity, that you should suddenly know what you want, who you are now, and what the next chapter looks like. But psychologically, that's rarely how it works. Rebuilding doesn't begin with answers, it begins with orientation, with learning how to relate to yourself again without relying on those old roles, external validation, or performance to tell you who you are. And that's uncomfortable, especially if your sense of self has been built around being capable, needed, or useful. When those markers drop away, it can feel like there's nothing solid underneath. There is. You just haven't had to listen to it for a long time. From a nervous system perspective, when you've spent years in survival mode or high responsibility, your attention is focused naturally outward. What needs doing? Who needs you? What's required of you? That outward focus is adaptive. It keeps things functioning. But it also means that the internal signals, your preferences, your desire, curiosity, even subtle discomfort get deprioritized, not ignored completely, but pushed more to the background. So when life slows or roles change, you consciously step away from old patterns, there can be a strange internal quiet. People often mistake that quiet for emptiness, but it isn't. It's unfamiliarity. It's your system no longer being driven by urgency or obligation, and you're not yet knowing what else to orientate around. This is why so many people feel tempted to rush the stage. They want a new identity, a new project, a new label, something to replace what's been lost. But Rebuilding a sense of self doesn't work like swapping one role for another. That just recreates the same dynamic, but with different packaging. Real rebuilding is much slower. It's relational. It's about restoring contact with yourself rather than constructing a new version of you. And that's where many people feel stuck because they don't know what that actually looks like. I want to be clear about something really important here. Rebuilding your sense of self is not about finding yourself as if there's a single, fully formed version waiting to be uncovered. And it's not about self improvement, it's about re-establishing trust, particularly self trust. Trust that you can listen to yourself again. Trust that your internal responses matter. Trust that you don't need to rush to define everything. From a positive psychology perspective, a strong sense of self isn't built through certainty. It's built through psychological flexibility, autonomy, and meaning. Through small, repeated experiences of being able to notice yourself, respond to yourself, and take yourself seriously. That's very different from having a 5-year plan. This is where people often worry they're doing it wrong. They'll say things like, I don't know what I enjoy anymore, or I don't know what I want, or I feel disconnected from myself. And they assume that's a problem to fix. But very often, it's a sign that you've stopped overriding yourself and you're now meeting parts of you were never given much airtime. When you've lived inside roles for a long time, your sense of self can become very narrow. Rebuilding widens it again. And widening takes time. It also takes safety. This is why the idea of starting can feel overwhelming. You're not just choosing an activity or a direction, you're learning how to be in a relationship with yourself without the scaffolding you're used to. I know this space personally. There was a period in my own life where I knew I couldn't go back to how I'd been living, but I also didn't have a clear sense of what came next. And everything in me wanted to resolve that quickly, to be decisive, to be clear, to be back on solid ground. But the most important work in that phase wasn't making decisions, it was staying present, allowing myself to notice what felt heavy, what felt relieving, what felt neutral, and what felt quietly alive. Not judging those responses, not rushing them into meaning, just letting them exist. That's not passive, it's attuned and it's foundational. When people talk about rebuilding a sense of self, they often imagine something quite active, a lot of doing. But psychologically, it often starts with receptivity, with paying attention to how you respond to the world now that you're not forcing yourself to be someone you're not anymore. This might sound subtle, and it is, but it is powerful because your sense of self doesn't come from thinking harder about who you are. It comes from noticing how you're experiencing yourself in different moments. What drains you? what steadies you, what sparks interest, even faintly. Those signals are easy to miss if you expect them to shout. They don't, especially not after years of being ignored. From a nervous system point of view, rebuilding is about expanding capacity gently, not pushing, not demanding clarity, but allowing yourself to have preferences again without immediately turning them into obligations. That's a big shift for people who are used to responsibility, and it's often where guilt appears. Guilt for resting, guilt for not knowing, guilt for not being as productive or decisive as you once were. That guilt doesn't mean you're regressing, it means your identity is reorganizing. And identity reorganization always feels uncomfortable before it feels stable. If you're listening to this and thinking, I don't even know what my next step is, I want to say this clearly. You don't need a next step yet. You need orientation. You need to feel yourself again in small ways without pressure. Rebuilding a sense of self is not a project, it's a process of remembering how to listen. And listening requires space. This is also where many people are tempted to hand themselves over to expert systems or frameworks to tell them now who they are. And while support can be helpful, rebuilding cannot be outsourced. No one else can tell you what feels true for you. It doesn't mean you have to do it alone. It means the authority stays with you. This is where well-being, identity, and nervous system health come together. A grounded sense of self emerges when your system feels safe enough to respond honestly, not performatively, not optimized, not for approval, just honestly. And that honesty often starts with very simple internal statements. This doesn't feel right anymore. This feels lighter than I expected. I don't know yet, and that's okay. These are not failures of clarity. They're signs of reconnection. If you're in this phase where the old ways no longer fit and the new ones haven't taken shape, you're not behind, you're doing something real. And real change is rarely linear or tidy. It's often quiet, uneven, and deeply internal. If you want to explore this further, you'll find resources on my website that focus on identity, self-worth, and rebuilding from the inside out, particularly if you're navigating this uncertain middle ground. You can find those at the Happya Hub and select Explore You. And you'll find the links to all of that in the show notes. And if you're sitting with the sense that you don't know where to start, let me leave you with this. You don't rebuild a sense of self by deciding who to be. You rebuild it by listening how to listen again. And that is a very good place to begin. So until next time, take care of you